Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the third installment of the 2025 Spring Seminar Series presentations hosted by the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies here at Simon Fraser University. My name is Evan Freeman. I'm Assistant Professor and Hellenic Canadian Congress of BC Chair in Hellenic Studies in the Department of Global Humanities. I'll be moderating today's talk. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event is taking place at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain, on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Roland Betancourt. Dr. Betancourt is Chancellor's Professor in the Department of Art History at University of California, Irvine, and currently holds the prestigious Andrew W. Mellon Professorship at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Dr. Betancourt is a scholar of Byzantium and modern popular culture, whose research lies at the intersection of histories of science and technology, intellectual history, and the history of art. His research has explored theories of sensation and perception, the transmission of ancient knowledge, technical illustrations and diagrams, musicological analyses of texts and their recitation, and the pre-modern histories of queerness, gender variance, and racialization. Dr. Betancourt is author of Sight, Touch, and Imagination in Byzantium, published by Cambridge in 2018, Byzantine Intersectionality, Sexuality, Gender, and Race in the Middle Ages, Princeton 2020, and Performing the Gospels in Byzantium, Sight, Sound, and Space in the Divine Liturgy, published with Cambridge in 2021, as well as many other edited volumes and articles. Today, Dr. Betancourt's talk is titled Queer Fragments of Byzantium. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Betancourt.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and sorry for bringing apparently bad weather with me. Is sound and everything okay? So Byzantine is an adjective that speaks to something inherently complicated and overwrought, filled with the weight of administrative detail, oratory flourishes, and rambling wordiness. It often conjures up images of a certain flamboyant aesthetic of wispy men in glittering drapery and of campy gilded icons filled with stone-cold women and their acrobatically contorted babies. In its modern imagination, the Byzantine operates as a modifier to weigh down the imputed glory of the Roman Empire, altering it through excessive decay and squandering its achievements as often described a life and effete outpost, words used by Edward Gibbon in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire from 1776. Since then, modern artists, poets, architects, and scholars may have learned to appreciate Byzantium's desire for complexity and aesthetic variety. But within the realms of the popular imagination, one can rarely locate this empire. Byzantium often only appears in passing, slipping through the cracks of the tail end of a joke or a montage, allowing itself to be effaced, appearing not as a historical citation in itself, but merely meant to serve as a fleeting instance of obtuse, conspicuous citation. In Gore Vidal's 1959 screen adaptation of Tennessee Williams' Suddenly Last Summer, Mrs. Venable, played by Katharine Hepburn, descends on an elevator while asking the young Dr. Kukrowitz, played by Montgomery Clift, the question, "Are you interested in the Byzantine doctor?" This film centers on the death of Mrs. Venable's erudite queer son, Sebastian, who used his mother and cousin as means to procure men to satiate his sexual desires during summer holidays. While the specifics of the narrative are obfuscated through overwrought suppressions and metaphors, it appears that the disgruntled masses of men he paid for sex ended up killing him and devouring his body. Throughout the film, we never see Sebastian directly, only captured obliquely through hazy recollections alone. Muddled by narrative intrigue and contemporary censorship laws, the film engages queerness only through the subject, such adjectival structures like the Byzantine. Thus, the end product is something that could easily be described as Byzantine lowercase in its own right, obscure, overwrought, and often deceptive. Such emergences of Byzantium as merely a passing cipher lead me to ask, why do modern figurations of the Byzantine Empire so often appear in these interstitial spaces of character development oriented around notions of sexuality, deviance, and excess? And most importantly, why does it appear as an adjective, always modifying something else, but never allowed to exist in and of itself, bereft of content in its own semantic promiscuity? Using the figuration of Sebastian's queerness as a model, my current book project, Queer, Byzantine, considers how Byzantium is articulated as an unspeakable queer figuration, removed from historical lineage, fixed identity, and even representability. In order to explore these ideas, I wish to walk us through Gore Vidal's critical scene in William's Suddenly Last Summer to parse out its handling of Byzantium and suggest how it is synonymous with Byzantium's appearance in much 20th and 21st century media. In Suddenly Last Summer, Katharine Hepburn makes a memorable first appearance as the quietly distraught Violet Venable, entering the scene in a lift inside her flamboyant New Orleans home. As she rides down in her elevator, Mrs. Venable delivers a monologue that introduces the figure of her son Sebastian and his queer erudition, details that become more poignant as we learn about the farcical intricacies of Sebastian's character and downfall. The elevator engines start with a clang and a loud hum, which announces Mrs. Venable's descent to her secretary and Dr. John Kukerwitz, who await her below. Starting before the elevator even comes into view, Mrs. Venable begins her monologue saying, "Sebastian always said, Mother, when you descend, it's like the goddess from the machine." Here, her secretary, Mrs. Foxhill, interjects stating the obvious. She's on her way down. Mrs. Venable is on her way down. Her voice filled with wonder and admiration, entranced by the spectacle with a fanatical fervor. Mrs. Venable then continues, "It's just like an angel coming to earth as I float into view." With those words, the shadow over her in the apparatus is lifted and her legs come into view, urging Dr. Kukerwitz to stand alert at her presence as it emerges from the darkness of the elevator shaft. "Sebastian, my son Sebastian, was always interested in the Byzantine. Are you interested in the Byzantine, doctor?" she inquires. With confused hesitation, Dr. Kukerwitz honestly replies, quote, "I don't know very much about the Byzantine." Mrs. Venable here takes pleasure in explaining to the confused doctor precisely what she means, saying, quote, "Well, it seems that the Emperor of Byzantium, when he received people in audience, had a throne, which during the conversation would rise mysteriously in the air to the consternation of the visitors. But as we are living in a democracy, I reverse the procedure. I don't rise, I come down." Mrs. Venable then glides toward him, shifting seamlessly into a more conventional introduction with a polite, "How do you do?" as if nothing had just happened. This monologue was interestingly absent from Tennessee Williams' original 1958 play, but was added specifically for the 1959 motion picture by Gore Vidal. Vidal's insertion describes quite accurately the automaton found in the reception room of the great triclinium of the Magnara within the great palace of Constantinople. Known as the Throne of Solomon, it is described in the 10th century Book of Ceremonies of Constantine VII, which is an account of the rituals of Constantinople, and is supported by a contemporary account by Liutprand of Cremona's embassies to the city in 948 and again in 966. As recounted in Liutprand's account of his audience with the emperor, he writes, quote, "The throne of the emperor was built with skill in such a way that at one instant it was low, then higher, and quickly it appeared most lofty. Thus, prostrated for a third time in adoration before the emperor, I lifted my head, and the person whom earlier I had seen sitting elevated to a modest degree above the ground, I suddenly spied wearing different clothes and sitting almost level with the ceiling of the mansion. I could not understand how he did this, unless perchance he was lifted up there by a pulley of the kind by which tree trunks are lifted. Then, however, he did not speak for himself, since even if he wished to, the great space between us would render it unseemly." End quote. Liutprand of Cremona's account makes evident the consternation of the visitor alluded to by Mrs. Venable, where the author marvels at the craft of the throne's machinery. Yet particularly poignant is the author's comment on the ineptitude of speech, given that the throne has risen to such an immense distance as to be nearly at the same height as the high ceiling, requiring an interpreter. In the case of Mrs. Venable, the monologue begins precisely as a muffled, disembodied voice, while the elevator and her figure still stand beyond the contemplation of Dr. Kukrowitz. While the subject of medieval automata is undoubtedly one that often captures the popular imagination, accounts of the Throne of Solomon certainly come from sources quite specific to Byzantine history that were not as readily accessible at this point in the middle of the 20th century. For example, the Book of Ceremonies was not translated into English in its entirety until 2012, available only in the original Greek and a French translation. The account of Ludpin of Cremona, however, was translated into English by F.A. Wright in 1930, and thus it serves as one of the potential sources for Vidal's careful allusion to its content and tone. Furthermore, in July 1954, an article dedicated to the Throne of Solomon and other automata in Byzantium was published in Speculum, the Journal of the Medieval Academy of America, presenting yet another possible source for Gore Vidal, who appears to have been reading such scholarly journals for his research at the time. In these Byzantine sources, it is evident that the levitating throne was but one of many automata found in the reception room, which included lions and a golden tree filled with hydropneumatic birds that allegedly all chirped in accordance with the song of their species. These latter automata famously inspired W.B. Yeats' 1926 Sailing to Byzantium, where the poet writes, "But such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling, to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past, or passing, or to come." Suffice to say, we can observe here a long-standing fascination with the Byzantine through its artistic, technological devices and their awe-inspiring workings, an intersection between technical innovation and the enchantment of technology. Not coincidentally, Gore Vidal published his extensively researched historical novel Julian in 1964, which is set in the early decades of the Byzantine Empire and which Vidal wrote from April 1959 to January 1964, as indicated by the dating on the closing page of the book. The level of meticulous research into the late antique and Byzantine world is indexed by Vidal's selected bibliography for the book on the following page, which lists some of the popular and academic sources consulted for the novel. This careful and obscure reference to the Byzantines in Suddenly Last Summer thus stands out as a creative insertion to contour the depth and complexity of Sebastian's character. Yet its detail and centerpiece in the film leaves a mark in ways that are difficult to overlook. The critical elevator scene opens with the arrival of Dr. Kukrowitz, played by Montgomery Clift, a psychiatrist regarded for his innovative use of lobotomies for the treatment of psychosis, who has been urgently summoned to the estate of Mrs. Venable. As will be revealed later in the film, Mrs. Venable hopes that Dr. Kukrowitz will perform a lobotomy on her niece, played by Elizabeth Taylor, who has become distraught after witnessing the brutal murder of Mrs. Venable's son Sebastian at the hands of cannibals while traveling with him in Spain the previous summer. Over the course of the film, the audience learns that the queer Sebastian utilized his young and beautiful cousin to procure men for him to sleep with, just as he had once done with his mother until her good looks began to fade. The elevator entrance is a critical moment in the film, given that it not only serves as the entry of the film's major star, Katharine Hepburn, but also introduces the ever-present absent figure of the son Sebastian. Sebastian, we are told, was an eccentric poet who wrote only one poem a year during his summer travels. His stunning learnedness is illustrated in the film by what would be more traditional markers of erudition and worldly sophistication in the period. That is, citing his knowledge of the ancient and classical world and his travels to the Galapagos Islands to observe the primal practices of the natural world. In his eclectic study, for example, Gore Vidal paints a picture of Sebastian via the objects contained therein through his detailed set descriptions in the film. In the script, quote, "They find themselves in a high room with tall windows. The curtains are drawn, light admitted only from the cracks where they do not meet. The room is ghostly in this half light. There is a tall Austrian Baroque wardrobe. Elsewhere in the studio are pieces of statuary, a life-size medieval Gothic saint pilfered from some cathedral, a copy or perhaps an original of a Donatello youth, a copy of Michelangelo's David, a Greek male torso, armless, headless, sexless. On one wall hangs a 12th century tapestry of Saint Sebastian, bristling with arrows and sanctity. Around the room are sofas and chairs, all in dust covers. In the actual set, we see masks of various styles, bejeweled skulls, models of ancient temples, classical sculpture fragments, an elaborate lectern stacked with photographs and drawings, a 500-year-old jester's chair, which we are told Sebastian used to sit in, and an endless array of books that fade into the background like wallpaper. The room is dominated by a painting, rather than a tapestry, of Saint Sebastian penetrated by arrows, which Mrs. Venable describes as, quote, brooding above us. Specifically, it is a reproduction of Botticelli's Saint Sebastian from 1474, produced for Santa Maria Maggiore in Florence, and now in Berlin. Here, the homoerotic figure of the penetrated saint echoes the consumed body of the son Sebastian, two martyrdoms bound by a modern queer erotics. The painting throughout the film is interrupted by the shadow of a cross upon its lower left side, and below it stands what appears to be a wooden arm reliquary that gestures up to that cruciform shadow while a skull sits beside it. Sebastian studied jumbles Renaissance and Baroque styles to make an association between his queerness and a certain form of excess and extravagance, punctuated by a fascination with the nude male body, aspects that are explicitly brought out by Vidal's set description. Mrs. Venable's Baroque elevator features ornate gates, seamed together at the corners, what appear to be thin and elongated palm trees that splinter out at the top. The lift itself has windows at the sides with embroidered curtains, and its front is open with an ornate frame that almost appears to be a picture frame hanging around the frontal figure of Mrs. Venable, as if transforming her into some early modern vision of a Byzantine icon. Its portal features a face prominently at eye level with Mrs. Venable, operating like a mask before her that sprouts tendrils, wrapping around to form the top of the elevator's gate. The elevator seems to have more in common with the lavish opulence of the Rococo than it does with any Byzantine throne imaginable, though. In fact, formally, there is not much that we might call Byzantine in any of Sebastian's objects or spaces throughout the film. Nowhere does Vidal indicate any Byzantine set pieces or make any other reference to things that would have spoken for Sebastian's alleged interest in the Byzantine. In a sense, the Byzantine only manifests itself in the film's spaces through that most colloquial use of the term to refer to something needlessly complicated, secretive, duplicitous, excessive, and bureaucratic. The Byzantine in that capacity is manifested in the film only through the eclectic juxtaposition of historical styles and artworks that emerge within Sebastian's orbit and the incessant, overwrought obfuscation of his sexuality. Narratively, what Mrs. Venable's query to the doctor about the Byzantine contributes to the story is a potent sense of defamiliarization and estrangement. The question and its response indicates the esoteric nature of Sebastian's knowledge and the obscurity of Byzantium itself. After all, when Mrs. Venable inquires, "Are you interested in the Byzantine doctor?" she does not ask whether he knows about Byzantium, but rather simply assumes that as a brilliant doctor, this learned man would have been privy to a certain education that would have made him at least familiar with the Byzantine Empire. Therefore, taking for granted that he would possess a basic knowledge, she asks instead whether he is interested in the Byzantine. Looking back at this scene after the rest of the film, it almost seems like Mrs. Venable is seeking whether this handsome young doctor might be a good fit for her deceased son, assessing whether they shared any common interests, as if it were difficult for her to shake her old habits of finding men for her son to sleep with. Yet I would push this even further to suggest that in asking whether he is interested in the Byzantine, Hepburn's character is actually asking the doctor if he, too, like her son Sebastian, is queer. When the doctor coyly acknowledges with regret and embarrassment that he does not know very much about the Byzantine, the casual audience may be informed precisely about the depth and obscurity of Sebastian's interests, But for a more in-the-know audience, it seems to articulate the Doctor's heterosexual identity against the obfuscated camp figuration of Byzantium here. In the Doctor's ignorance of the Byzantine, the film creates an interesting conflation between the adjectival reference to Byzantium and the adjective's colloquial use as referring to something overwrought and obscure, the very role that Byzantium plays within the film's narrative and the character's development. It has often been remarked that Suddenly Last Summer is highly self-referential. Tennessee Williams' beloved sister Rose was diagnosed with schizophrenia early in her life, and in 1943 was subjected to a lobotomy and institutionalized for the rest of her life. This places Williams squarely in the role of Sebastian, the author. It is quite appropriate that Williams' close friend and confidant, Gore Vidal, would write the screenplay for the film, so it is as much a demonstration of Vidal's erudition as it is filled with accuracies of their relationship and inside jokes. In one letter dated to January 27, 1954, for example, Williams writes to Vidal to catch him up on his life with a tongue-in-cheek candor and distinctively coded statements. Williams, who had been afflicted by hemorrhoids, has not been able to socialize much, writing coyly to Vidal that, quote, "The weather is divine here. Those of our sisters who get around freely at night have reported sensational fortune," end quote. And ending the letter about their mutual friend, Oliver, who has been living a very disorderly life in New Orleans, cruising fervishly at night and day and doing no work, but looks and seems to feel well. In a letter from the late 1940s, Williams shared a similar candor, the details of their friends' sex lives, detailing which of their friends had been afflicted by gonorrhea, writing humorously, "The French actor is still around. He has the clap now, the only one of us to be stricken, just as when he was getting over the crabs." And he closes the same letter to Vidal with a flirtatious longing, writing there, quote, "An affectionate and mildly libidinous kiss on your softer upper lip, which I never kissed," end quote. These letters speak not only to the intimacy of Vidal and Williams' friendship, but also to how much of Williams was in Sebastian's character. Certainly, much of what is recounted about Sebastian can be found in these letters between Vidal and Williams. Much of Williams' updates to Vidal regard his experience of cities, that is, his cruising and sex life in those places. In one letter from 1951 provides a scene-by-scene report of his travels, noting that, quote, "He took in Munich, good cruising, 3 very good gay bars, and had his, quote, most exciting lay in London of all places," end quote. Like Sebastian's summer holiday, Williams speaks of seasons in different cities, and these times in different cities seem to ebb and flow according to his sexual desires for the men present there. In Suddenly Last Summer, for example, Taylor's character recounts how they were planning to leave Spain because Sebastian had tired of the men there and was looking for, quote, blondes. In the self-effacing figuration of Sebastian, Williams depicts a queer character that has often been criticized, both by contemporaries and later audiences, for its self-hating and self-destructive nature. In fact, many of the developments that occur throughout Suddenly Last Summer demonstrate that Sebastian's interests are all tinged with a macabre, sadomasochistic fascination. In the Galapagos, for example, Sebastian was entranced by the scene of seagulls flipping over the hatchling turtles and devouring their young flesh as they attempted to flee into the sea. It was this confrontation with grotesque suffering that Sebastian claimed to be the full manifestation of truth, saying that he saw the face of God in that horrific scene. Mrs. Venable, however, states that she refused to believe him until, quote, "Suddenly last summer, I learned my son was right, that he had shown me what he had shown me in the Encantadas was the horrible, the inescapable truth," end quote. A lesson learned from Sebastian's unspeakable downfall. Sebastian's fascination with the grotesque, Sebastian's God even, is a fascination with the inescapable intricacies and workings of the natural world denuded in such places of primal violence. Williams' work takes its name precisely from that moment of that confrontation with these realities, stressing the abject rupture that occurs when the exterior flesh is rent from its substratum, when that which has been divinely concealed is revealed through that grotesque violence of feasting on flesh, just as Sebastian's downfall. This whole exchange between Dr. Kukowitz and Mrs. Venable regarding the trips to the Galapagos and Sebastian's death occurs soon after the elevator monologue in the garden that Sebastian had curated at their home. Ominous music plays, worthy of a Hitchcock thriller, as Dr. Kukowitz gazes onto Sebastian's arboretum, which is described by Mrs. Venable as being like, quote, the dawn of creation, to which the kind doctor replies, and frankly, a little terrifying. Guiding him through the tropical wilderness, Mrs. Venable stops and leans down before an encased carnivorous plant and begins to feed her live insects. The tone of the scene is quite hostile as parallels are drawn between the carnivorous plant and Mrs. Venable herself, who has insects flown in at great expense to feed the Venus flytrap, which she states is so aptly named after the goddess of love. The whole garden is anchored visually by what Oliver Messel, the film's set designer, in preparatory drawings referred to as the Temple of Narcissus. This large, classicizing structure seeks to abridge a temple facade, yet it achieves this through a colonnade topped with a pedimented arch reminiscent of the 4th century palace of Diocletian at Split. It would appear that the allusion to Narcissus serves as a metaphor for Sebastian's homosexuality as captured by Narcissus' self-erotic gaze. The architectural language is one that alludes to a uniquely late antique architectural style, and it is this temple facade that serves precisely as the doorway into Sebastian's studio. While Mrs. Venable's Byzantine reference is devoid of the explicitly threatening glosses that Sebastian's garden manifests, it is worth recalling that in the mid-20th century, Byzantium's reputation was still entrenched in a narrative of decline and fall as propagated by Edward Gibbon, one of Vidal's key sources for Julian, and punctuated by figures of moral corruption and excess, such as the Empress Theodora and her portrayal in the late 19th century popular culture, as in Victorien Sardou's play on her life. We can see Sebastian's concern for the Byzantine to be in line with a stereotype of excessive hedonistic figures who find their realization only in a form of self-destruction. It is clear, however, that Byzantium played a quiet yet special role in Gore Vidal's life. The vision of his own queerness and even his friendship with Tennessee Williams. In the early 1990s, Gore Vidal was actually working on a screenplay for a movie on the Byzantine Empress Theodora. The film was to be made by Universal Studios and directed by Martin Scorsese, yet eventually fell through. In the early drafts of the screenplay, Gore Vidal opened the film with the arrival of a foreign dignitary into the throne room of the Byzantine emperor, once again giving an epic opening nod to the Byzantine throne and its automata. And I will also say that Martin Scorsese clearly lost interest in the movie, and in the archives there are these great, probably drunk notes from Gore Vidal to Martin being like, Marty, you're going to lose me when I get too expensive. You should really sign the deal for this movie. And the screenplay is wonderfully chaotic. Near the end of his life, when an interviewer arrived at his home for an audience, the ailing Vidal was carried down the stairs, and the interviewer notes actually that he made a joke about descending in the throne in a nod to Suddenly Last Summer. Clearly for Vidal, Byzantium and the weight of the scene carried a deep importance throughout his life. In an undated letter, datable most likely to the summer of 1970, Williams writes an apology to Vidal after having angered him due to his poor behavior at a party they threw together. There, Williams reflects on their friendship, and in a single-line paragraph, he lovingly states to Vidal, quote, "We were born to the purple as well as the lavender, dear," uniting, of course, the imperial purple of the Roman Byzantine Empire with the lavender of queerness. It would seem that the Byzantines served to articulate in passing the excess, camp, and imagination of queerness for these two men, of sentiments that could sometimes not be explicitly expressed, and at other times are just more fun to express obliquely through oratory flourish. In his adaptation of his dear friend's play for the screen, Vidal's articulation of Sebastian appears to approach the figure with a certain tenderness or care. The villain of the film is repeatedly clarified as Katharine Hepburn's character as the movie proceeds, who seeks to erase the truth about Sebastian and harm his young cousin with a lobotomy. Instead, Sebastian comes into view as a character who can never be fully realized or articulated because those who remain, his mother, refuse to articulate him. We never see Sebastian's face in the movie. Only his shadow and silhouette appear in the flashbacks and recollections. It is this indeterminacy and the disagreement between Taylor and Hepburn about what even occurred last summer that provides for me a model for thinking about the Byzantine akin to Sebastian's portrayal, a fleeting cipher that appears always in passing, but without any concrete articulation, whose identity is unspeakable and whose history cannot be agreed upon. Of particular interest to me is the fact that Hepburn does not ask Montgomery Clift if he knows anything about the Byzantine Empire, but speaks precisely of the Byzantine. While she goes on to concretize this with the context of Byzantium proper, the substantiation of the adjective here asks the doctor whether he is interested not in the Byzantine Empire per se, but rather in all those things that are Byzantine, understood colloquially to mean what is excessive and overwrought, but also what pertains to the empire that is largely forgotten, put down, and marginalized. In Vidal's screenplay, however, Dr. Kukrowicz betrays an added awareness regarding the question, replying, "No, I don't know much about Byzantium." This response suggests that Kukrowicz understood what was being asked of him and admits his lack of knowledge about this medieval empire. However, in the movie, Clift instead just mirrored Hepburn, replying, "I don't know very much about the Byzantine," as the adjective. Thus, the doctor parrots the phrasing of the question being asked of him, wholly erasing the notion that he could even make sense of the question itself. By maintaining the adjective as such, he affirms his ignorance and the implausibility of Byzantium's intelligibility. Together, Sebastian the Byzantine model a formulation of how the Byzantine Empire has been represented and imagined in modern and contemporary popular culture, one that is consistently denied of meaning, even when it is evident that those deploying the citation know it quite well. It is this mutual dialogue between Sebastian's queerness and the queerness of Byzantium that I find most generative for exploring a host of other such passing and isolated fragments of Byzantium, which without this embrace of the adjectival nature of queerness could not be holistically understood or acknowledged as having a shared space. In the time I have remaining, I wish to consider the ways in which these meditations of queerness, and more esoterically, on the queer fragments of Byzantium, can propose a new approach to thinking about Byzantine art. Over more than a decade, scholars across Byzantine studies have interrogated the applicability of Byzantium to describe the world we study. Both the terms Byzantine and Empire have been scrutinized for their inability to represent the ways in which the people we study self-identified and how they practiced their governance. While the Byzantines often refer to themselves simply as Romans, and use the term Byzantines to refer to the inhabitants of Constantinople instead, qualified nomenclature like the Eastern Roman Empire to refer to Byzantium brings along with it a whole new set of problems, ones that present an issue for our field's own legibility in the present, imperiled enough as it is, or that similarly fail to adhere to the Roman identity that Byzantine imperial sources portray. On the other hand, desires to reframe the practice of empire through various notions from a Byzantine commonwealth to Caldelus's Roman land speak to other hesitations about what is meant by empire and how a disparate set of regions allied themselves to a certain Byzantine identity or artistic heritage. Even when they did not neatly fit into the rule traditionally entailed by imperial structures, ancient, medieval, or otherwise. As art historians, beyond asking what is Byzantine art, we must imagine also what Byzantine art can be. I am deeply skeptical of any efforts to rename fields or disciplines that keep its internal structures and disciplinarity intact. It is necessary to eschew the attachment to chronicity within the humanities that have been so recently steeped in, not by challenging Byzantium as a term, but by embracing its ambiguities and problematics as a critical space for art historical research. The adjectival Byzantine offers new routes for historiographic, institutional, and disciplinary growth by presenting a capacious area of research that need not be limited by sociopolitical bodies, geographic landscapes, or even temporal periods. Byzantine art as it stands cannot simply be limited to the chronological range or lands of the Byzantine Empire as defined by its most conventional definitions. Byzantine art, by definition, must include the realities of a late Roman world and a so-called post-Byzantine endurance of its traditions across the Mediterranean and the Slavic world, well beyond the 15th century and into the present. Then it becomes necessary to imagine as well a Byzantine art that is inclusive not only of areas like Armenia, Georgia, Nubia, Ethiopia, and the Syriac world, but that also embraces the temporal disjuncture of working across discrete disciplines and areas of study in ways that reframe our art historical understanding of these boundaries. To illustrate this point, I have often turned to Kehinde Wiley's iconic series from 2014. In these works, Wiley and his workshop created 8 portraits of men depicted upon gold ground with the gestures and attributes of Byzantine holy figures. In Wiley's St. Gregory Palamas, a shirtless man covered in tattoos touches his ring finger to his thumb over his chest with the right hand. This cites a common Byzantine symbol of blessing, as seen, for example, in the 14th century wall paintings of St. Gregory of Palamas from Vatopedi on Mount Athos. In his left hand, Wiley's sitter carries a tome, just as Palamas does in the Vatopedi image, heavily ornate gospel book. However, the Wiley instead carries Alfredo Tiradiggio's Icons and Saints of the Eastern Orthodox Church, published in translation by the Getty in 2006. This figure is not costumed and does not carry a gold gem-encrusted book. Instead, he is depicted as he was on the street, and the book in the artist's studio now finds its way as a stand-in for Gregory's accoutrement. Note in particular the green post-it tabs poking out from the top of the well-used text. Here, Wiley spares us the superficial weight of visual or formal citations beyond the posing and gestures of the body, which come to construct the identity of this man as St. Gregory. The book that he presents to us figures forth the logic of the painting, whereby this guide to Byzantine iconography, which presumably served as the working Bible for Wiley's project, comes to substitute the Gospels depicted in the medieval portrait. The series works with this eloquent scarcity, whereby it seems that Wiley investigates what the limits of iconography and identity are through this paring down. The sitter's name even inscribed below the image, insisting upon our sight another identity as well that is not Palamas. Such works question, of course, the bounds of where we can make secure identifications. We are led to ask where and how the limits of iconography lie, and how do we as viewers, because of a titular marker, attempt to grasp and comprehend the possibilities of history and citation offered up by an image. As a Byzantine art historian, I often see Byzantium in unlikely places, understanding elements that are distinctly Byzantine in objects and architectures from different places and periods. And my proposition here is simple. Why can't all these other things be Byzantine too? Not just homologies or citations, but proper works of a longer history of Byzantine art. And how then would we have to rewrite the history of art as an act of recuperation through inarticulate absence and unspeakable loss? What modern historiography of Byzantine art has done is expand, specifically by virtue of its marginalization and conflations, the Byzantine as a category, releasing it from the strictures of the Byzantine Empire as a spatially and temporally demarcated zone. Rather than attempting to correct this historiography to which Byzantine art history owes so much of its generative potential, my proposition here then is that we deploy this operation of Mrs. Venable, the Byzantine, subversively, as a way of rewriting a history that is simultaneously occurring in various spaces at once. How might certain formal gestures, even crude stereotypes of Byzantine art, like flatness, frontality, gold ground, or mosaic tesserae, define the identifying provenances of Byzantine art in ways that upset the notion of objects and works needing to come from a particular time and space? This capacious revisioning of Byzantium not only embraces the various Orthodox communities that have forged their artistic legacies for centuries in the guise of Byzantium, but also the various marginalized communities that have found in Byzantium a space for critical reimagining and subversion against a Western Middle Ages. In looking, for example, at Titus Kafar's Contour of Lost from 2020, I am struck as a Byzantine art historian by the poignant nuances of this work that speak in very distinctly Byzantine ways. In his cut canvas paintings, as the Met's catalog entry reads, Kafar cites, quote, Renaissance and Baroque Madonnas, end quote, to reference, quote, the casual factors of gun, police, and environmental violence on Black bodies, end quote. These Madonnas, while a favorite of Renaissance and Baroque artists, however, can be traced through the influx of this object type in Italian painting from the Byzantine world. And in that recognition, there are depths to this painting that become not merely citational, but richly nuanced, even theological arguments. The tug at the hem of the mother's shirt that speaks to the humanity of the child, his willful and even volatile human nature, her distant gaze that captures the pain of his impending death, her knowledge of what is to come for the child, even before he is old enough to know for himself. Whether she seeks solace or reprieve from suffering in the object of that gaze is for the viewer to ponder and debate. And that poignant cutout, which to a modern day passerby simply speaks to loss and absence, is a potent confrontation with the limits of representation. Centuries of discourse in Byzantium about the circumscribability of Christ in an image led to metaphors about the mother's flesh and its ability to contain that which was uncontainable, and that which exceeds the bounds of painting. In looking at this image with Byzantine eyes, yes, of course, I can feel the pain of the mother. I can recall Simeon's words to Mary at the presentation of Christ at the temple, as told in Luke, telling her that, quote, a sword will pierce your very soul, end quote. I can also read pain in a way that modern viewers might not quite comprehend given her stoic stare. And I also feel the present absence of that child divine, his unforgiving murder at the hands of imperial power, and the endless cries of painting demanding to make him representable even beyond the limits of artistic skill and might. These are things only Byzantium can allow us to see. In thinking through these possibilities, my call to queer fragmentation serves somewhat as an apology, an excuse for my idiosyncratic interest in cropping and exerting these citational fragments of Byzantium. After all, in works of Wiley, Byzantium is only one of many ciphers through which the artist cloaks his figures. In the work of Titus Kaphar, both the cutout and the art historical citation figure prominently across other pieces, pieces that are far less anchored in this generic vocabulary, often merely cited as, of course, Renaissance and Byzantine painting, across gallery websites and museum catalogs. Yet these Byzantine fragments produce ruptures in how we look. In Kafar's From a Tropical Space from 2019, two women with their strollers present a similar use of the cutout child, making the encounter between the two akin to a visitation scene. More so, I am interested in the handling of color here, a composition that is dominated by flat swaths of color and bleeding divisions between foreground and ground that I am so accustomed to witnessing in the backgrounds of Byzantine art, like the palm tree on the right that flickers in between grass and sky. In turn, I take a newfound appreciation to a work like Kafar's Shifting Gaze, completed during his 2017 TED Talk. Here, Kafar produced a loose copy of a family portrait by Franz Hals and culminated his talk by proceeding to whitewash away the white figures in the scene in order to shift the gaze onto the Black boy, which had been long ignored by audiences and art historians. The use of white paint to erase the figures is not only coded here with the erasure of whiteness, but speaks to a long history of whitewashing images for their concealment and all the double meanings that can take. By covering up these images just enough, Kafar refocuses attention, but also speaks carefully to the contest of representation in manners that, of course, harken back to debates about the power of images and iconoclasm. But more so, he critically understands that the destruction of images alone is not enough, but rather the display of the destroyed image as an argument is critical to articulate its contested status. Throughout other works, Kafar has also contemplated other practices of erasure, including gestures of undoing, shredding, and covering up figures upon canvas. Many of these works have focused on iconic portraits and figures that also speak to questions of iconicity so readily inflected by our Byzantine past. But of all of Kafar's work, the Jerome Project series perhaps most poignantly attests to his direct formal interest in the Byzantine. In the 2014-2015 series, Kafar produced gold ground devotional images derived from the mugshots of 97 men with the same first and last name as his father, as he attempted to track down his estranged parent. Originally, he dipped the portraits in tar depending on how long the person had been imprisoned, contemplating the erasure of the figure in a different take on the iconoclastic gesture, whereby concealment is not emancipatory but a marker of imperial brutality and incarceration. Beyond the formal connections to Byzantium attested in the Jerome Project, it is very evident that Titus Kaphar is a very Byzantine artist, or dare I say, simply a Byzantine artist, contemplating matters regarding iconoclasm, iconicity, present absence, and the limits of representation. While I believe that Kafar's work in this capacity deserves far greater attention, I want to take this as an invitation for us to envision a history of art in which Byzantium threads the needle across time, as an invitation to think through form and bring down upon it the weight of complex debates about image making and representation that uniquely set Byzantium apart from any other period in history. I sincerely believe that there are things only the Byzantine can offer the history of art. And through it, we can walk unimpeded from the funerary portraits of the Fayum oasis to the tar-dipped icons of Kafar's confrontations with mass incarceration and the erasure of the Black body. To do this work, we require a more richly speculative art history that dwells in the form and movements of works of art, which embraces the historical as a weighty analytical vault rather than as anachronism, and takes it as an invitation for mourning and world building. Thank you.
We have time for questions, and I think the online audience is able to submit questions to the Q&A box.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, thanks for this. This was. I'm not an art historian, so this might come off as a bit kind of. I love the idea of Byzantine as a kind of this big umbrella that's transient and all that. But I have a question about the first half of the talk.
Yeah.
So you talked about the Byzantine, the meaning of it kind of fitting the kind of usual arcane, obscure, something decadent, and all that. So do you see in popular culture, I guess in the US, the mid-20th century or around kind of Vidal's very thriving time, do you see what would be the comparison of Byzantine versus Hellenic or Greek? I'm thinking right in the UK, we have Forrester with Morris, with like the Grecian way means kind of, you know, the gateway. And even like I heard it recently, like a Diego in Spanish, continental Spanish means like to do anal, right? And it's like a normal colloquial term. So we see way less of anything kind of Byzantine being applied to that. So I'm just thinking in the US popular culture, clearly I'm guessing ancient Greece is way more represented. So and then, but what would be the kind of the queerness of Byzantium vis-a-vis or versus the queerness of the Grecian way, if it makes sense? Or are they sometimes just conflated?
Yeah, no, I think what Byzantium has that sort of ancient Greece does not have is Christianity. And I think that becomes a very interesting route for artists who are contemplating a certain attachment to Christianity oftentimes. And so what I find in a lot of this work beyond these examples is that you have artists who are almost trying to embrace the medieval, but they can't because the Western Christian image is too Christian in its stereotypical sense. And so Byzantium becomes this space where there's a lot of room for embrace. And I mean, we can see this even in scholarship with sort of the ways in which Byzantium was often used to, you know, like John Boswell to say there are possibilities in Byzantium that are not offered in the West. Eunuchs, I think, are a big part of this. Sort of the stereotypes about Byzantium in Gibbon are a big part of this. So I think that's the real way in which this longer history of Hellenism sort of ruptures with Byzantium being set in opposition. And what is really interesting is that, of course, there's not even a visual vocabulary for it, which I find really interesting. So you have, of course, Vidal's very interested in Byzantium. He's thinking about this. There is nothing Byzantine in the entire set. Although I recently rewatched the movie and I think I might have missed like a manuscript page on the back wall or something, but there's not really anything. And even the set descriptions are very much like what you would imagine. It's ancient Greece and the Renaissance, naked male bodies and so on. And so I think that's really for me what it is. It's sort of the negotiation of Christianity. And I think oftentimes authors who are themselves in some ways religious that are trying to embrace a sort of where their queerness fits in. Yeah.
First of all, it was really, really fascinating. Thanks so much. I'm really feeling a lot of connectivity between all the different time periods, like fragments that you're talking about, and the idea of Byzantium, the through line between antiquity and modernity. It's just super fascinating. I'm seeing connections to my own research because I do a lot of Greco-Roman reception in popular culture. And I just wanted to ask a bit more about your methodology and like what brought you to these specific, seemingly disparate pieces of media. Like what persuaded you to like see all this common ground and kind of knit them all together into this really interesting talk?
This is what happens when you work on a very esoteric portion of art history and you exist in the world. I mean that sincerely. Like a lot of this project has been sort of in the background for years because it's been just a process of noticing things. So I will give credit where credit is due. I found out about this movie because my undergraduate advisor, Bob Osterhout, recommended the movie because of the citation of Byzantium. He also recommended the drag performance of Charles Busch, who did a whole play called Theodora, She Bitch of Byzantium, which is based on Sardou's Theodora play. It has nothing to do with Byzantium, but it's still amazing. And so that's one of the chapters in this book. And so and then I think this book in some ways really came into focus when I was watching an episode of New Girl, the TV show, and she's in a hotel room and calls the front desk and asks for an adult film, maybe something exotic from the Byzantine era. And I just thought, why is Byzantium always sexualized in these weird ways? And it's sort of, that was the sort of through line that I really confronted the reality that Byzantium's not there, but when it's emerging, it's coming out in a very particular way, which was really helpful for seeing this through line. And I mean, a lot of this work also has been informed by a lot of archival research. And so I've gone through Gore Vidal's archive and the archives of the set designers and so forth. And so there's also been sort of this mapping out of this. I actually, not to plug something I did, but I did a conversation with a set designer for an exhibition on Byzantium and popular culture that was in Istanbul. And it was actually a really fascinating conversation with a set designer because this is the guy who he's did Harry Potter, he did Game of Thrones, he's done every form of medievalism ever. And talking to him about, why did we're talking about specifically a scene in Justice League, the extended version, where Wonder Woman goes into a crypt and has the confrontation with Byzantine frescoes. And literally it was this whole thing where we had this long conversation of like, but why Byzantium? He's like, I don't know. It's like, no, but let's think through this. And he was literally like, well, it's not ancient and it's not modern and it has to be Greek because she's Greek. And I'm like, okay. And then what about God? And it's like, well, we can't represent God in any capacity. Everything has to be super secular in anything we do for Hollywood set designs. Right, exactly. But so it was this whole sort of confrontation with like the ways in which these conversations about Byzantium are happening in very smart ways that people are not always conscious of what they're doing. It was one of those conversations where I was just like, I was fascinated that I was having the conversation. And so it was really, I recommend that just for what he's saying, not what I'm saying. But yeah.
Hi, that was wonderful. I was really interested in the first part of the piece in terms of, we're talking about Tennessee Williams' play, we're talking about Gore Vidal's well, I have a couple questions. My first question, which is easy and historical, relatively easy and historical, is rereading the Yates poem.
Yeah.
The line of what is past or passing or to come. I think this is a reference to the mantic qualities of sort of statuary in Byzantium, and kind of romantic qualities that can be attached to them? Or is this something that wouldn't have been necessarily available, you know, to the popular mind?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Like my historiographic brain is trying to think about when certain texts were being translated. Um, that is a really interesting question. I'll have to think about that. I mean, I will have to check sources actually. Um, I'm trying to think if anything is queued up in my mind. I don't have an answer, but I'm intrigued by that. Um, because it could be very interesting. And I mean, I find the poem's not a huge focus. It's sort of like I have to cite it because everyone that does this has to cite it. And I've gone down the rabbit hole on the poem and some of the citations, but I can't remember. So I have some ideas. Yeah. Yeah.
With, you know, with allusions to Byzantine, that and the way that the Byzantine and the Southern Gothic
Yes.
are interacting
Yes.
in this. That they're in dialogue,
Oh,
even
yeah.
if things aren't obviously.
Yeah.
Byzantine, it makes me think of a movie. It's an adaptation of The Turn of the Screw with Deborah Kerr from around the same.
I've totally seen this, like in
Yes,
high school.
Yes. Find this broken statue of an Eros, and these spiders start, or a spider crawls out of its mouth, and sort of this almost like Byzantine image of this overgrown garden, and then you know this classical statue that's sort of beautiful, but is sort of grimacing from its cracked mouth. It's almost like Christo-Lurian view of, I don't know.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, the garden is something that it's on my to-do list of things that so what I'm thinking of doing, the book is essentially going to be just, what would you have like here? Every chapter will be about Sebastian. That is my plan at the moment, as a way of entering these broader conversations. And so I know that there needs to be a chapter on the garden, and I don't have any brilliant thoughts about the garden yet. And so I'm thinking about it because it's really interesting. I mean, so one of the things that actually came up, and I don't know if anyone noticed this, but I blurred things out here. Because I was recently made aware and found out that there are some very racist representations here that have very direct sort of specific localizations in like New Orleans and like slave quarters. And so in thinking about territory and the space of this, you know, Southern Gothic manor, also is something that I'm very much working on at the moment. And so I'm really interested in thinking about how this and questions of the garden, which is sort of this like enclosed space, which I think is really fascinating. It's very obviously a set, which I think is sort of part of it. It really feels like the house wraps around it. And so I'm very interested in exploring out how that's sort of engaging with a sort of legacy of slavery in particular, and how some of the constructions, if we think of this as the throne room, the Byzantine throne room, the entire living room, then what are sort of the dynamics that are happening there? So that's something that I'm currently working on, just to FYI. Yeah.
On the garden theme and thinking about notions of displacement and recreation that come with slavery. Monomachos' engagement with gardening, with himself, with them is interesting because he's the person who explicitly himself would take nature and be racinating and be transported in order to create something of his own. And I'm not exactly sure when the French translation of Celos first appeared, or even the English translation that Vidal might have access to these notions. If gardens are interested in them.
That's really interesting. I had been thinking about like hunting gardens and things like that. But that's a really interesting citation. I'm definitely going to follow up on that. I don't. Yeah, no, exactly.
So that the Christian would fear and how that fits there or not.
Oh yeah, and it's also just there is also this interesting, you know, it's the Galapagos, which is sort of this like almost like secularized Garden of Eden sort of trope that he has recreated, and it's barbaric, and there's a lot of interesting things with the garden that I have been thinking about, but that's really great. And I mean, one of the things that I haven't written about, because honestly, my information's not too great, but he was friends with Runciman, and I have like correspondence with them, but none of the correspondence is good enough. Like it's just like Merry Christmas. And so there's a relationship there, which I'm very intrigued about. And a ton of correspondence from like the Journal of Modern Greek Studies being like, please write something for us. He being like, I'll do it eventually. So he has a direct line of conversation with Byzantinists at the time. So I do think there is potentially something there. It's interesting.
That is what we do, because in the invasion of Mesopotamia, they go through
Yes.
Parthian or Persian gardens. I think
Yeah.
Completing with names or something. I don't know.
Yeah. I need to return to Julian actually. Yeah. Now that I'm thinking about gardens, I need to go. Let me go there and then. Yeah.
Thinking of the Cambridge ritualists and the Orphic moths and so on. Are they reading that stuff and just conflating the super ancient with the Byzantine?
I mean, that's always a question of what they're thinking about. I feel like there's enough in a lot of these things, there's enough of an awareness of what Byzantium is that I know they're actually talking about Byzantium, and it's not just a cipher of something more ancient. If that's what you're asking. So I think there is a sort of very concrete awareness of sort of a historical specificity.
Well, I'm just thinking here, people of my parents' generation were reading the Global Battle, at university.
Right.
So I imagine these guys were too. And that kind of Orphic religion.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll keep an eye out for that. I haven't come across anything, but yeah.
In the late 19th century with the
Right.
Orphics and
Yeah.
Decadence and Oscar Wilde.
Right.
And it's maybe a bit obvious, but.
And the Bloomsbury groups own interest. Yeah,
they love that group stuff.
No, in this project, it basically starts in the mid 20th century.
My point is more like that piece of subculture exists and is probably influencing.
Of course. Yeah, no, completely. Yeah. One character who I always get asked about how he fits into this is Thomas Whittemore, which I'm very interested. For those who don't know, Thomas Whittemore, basically part Byzantinist, but responsible for the revealing of many of the mosaics in Hagia Sophia. Very much a homosexual, died mysteriously at the State Department, is in an unmarked tomb. Very mysterious things about his life, which I keep thinking I should put in like a Freedom of Information Act request for his dossier to learn more. But yeah, he's another figure that I've been thinking about, because there are also some really interesting like queer Byzantinist networks happening in the first half of the 20th century that a lot of colleagues have written about, and so I'm less interested in that. Also, I've been staying for a little bit later, but I think it might be helpful maybe to clarify some of those questions.
I think Kabapi as well.
Right. Yeah, of course.
Yo Mishima, you know Confessions of a Mask?
No, I don't know that.
Novel by Yugo Mishra.
Oh.
And there's a Saint Sebastian, he's young, and when he has his first masturbatory experiences looking at that painting, and then Mishima, as the writer himself, has a portrait of himself posed as Saint Sebastian.
Yes, the Saint Sebastian is a whole. I don't even go into it, because Saint Sebastian's like a whole book on queer reception. Yeah. What? Oh yeah, of course. Yes. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Here.
Oh, okay, or I can't see the hand behind.
No. I also get completely.
So
yeah.
is it better now?
Yes, it is
Okay,
your turn. And then,
so I was wondering about how you, or yeah, I'm looking for clarification basically on whether you see Vidal's engagement with Byzantium as genuine, and also about how you might see Vidal's position within queer studies. So with some of the stuff that you mentioned in Kafar with like the challenges of representation, a lot of that is in um, um, this film with like the shadows of Sebastian and everything like that. So I thought I saw some similarities there. And it's evident to me that Vidal sees a lot of meaning in Byzantium. So I'm not sure if he's robbing it of meaning or like adding meaning to it. And then what I thought was that since he's reading scholarly articles about this with a queer lens, there was kind of a separate question that was attached to this about so the erudite queer culture, like in this movie, it's historically so important, but we don't really have it anymore. But we do have formalized queer studies. But could you say that the kind of work that Vidal is doing is also like queer studies in a way? So maybe he is doing queer Byzantine studies with his work. What do you think about that? Sorry.
I mean, I love that. Yeah, in some ways, it's like, yeah, that's in some ways like implicitly a point here that is sort of what he's doing. In fact, I mean, one of the reasons why I say that now sort of Sebastian will be the entire book in some ways is because I feel that what Vidal does with Byzantium is very specific, has a lot of clarity, and is generating meaning in a very particular way that is sort of like a thesis in its own right, that in many ways captures what I'm seeing in a sort of history of popular culture that last for, the rest of the century and into the present. And so I do think that like what Vidal is doing is really sort of foundationally theorizing Byzantium as this sort of queer space and is generating meaning quite purposely, especially throughout his returns to it. One of the things that for me has also, well, two things. I will say his Theodora script is ridiculous, and it is ridiculously homoerotic. So there are all these scenes. At one point, there's like this whole scene about like they're going to war, so he needs eunuchs, but he needs military eunuchs. So he's got to castrate them, but he's got to do it with the ones that are already muscular and hunky. And so there's this whole thing about young, hunky men being tied up and castrated. And it's just like, what? No, Martin Scorsese is not going to direct this movie. And so there's stuff like that that's just what I love about that script, which I was shocked to find, is just that it really sort of captures the importance that this played throughout his lifetime. And in some ways, given that it's very much later in his life, there's almost like a sort of totally delusional quality to it, which like I think almost maps out a lot more of the like his imaginary of Byzantium in a more eloquent way, which he hadn't sort of had the opportunity to do. It's almost like that project that you're sort of waiting to do and never get to. And so I think that's been that was really sort of clarifying for what Vidal was in some ways doing. I think there's a lot more subtlety and nuance and complexity in what is happening in Suddenly Last Summer. But I think it very much sort of solidifies a lot of these trends. There was another answer that I was going to say. I don't know if you want to ask a follow-up, but
okay.
Yeah.
I hope you remember your other answer, but thanks for the one that you gave.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
I just, while we were talking about the gardens, and sort of the garden as paradise, and then you think of Manasses, the exorcist of the Garden of Eden, and of the exorcies in later of gardens and later Byzantine novels, Kirtakinos' exorcist of the garden in which the Annunciation happens, and this idea of this maternal figure that is tending to this Edenic. I mean, it's very interesting. I wonder if you can grab that or go outside.
Yeah. So one of the things that has been sort of on my mind, perplexing me, and I don't think I have an image. No, I don't have an image of it. Is that with this garden in particular? I mean, I haven't gone down a tree of knowledge carnivorous plant type mentality, even though it's like possibility in my brain. one of the things that's very present in the garden, in the temple space, is that there's this giant figure of sort of an angel of death. It's sort of like a grim reaper with a reaper, and then he has angel wings. And that's where they have the whole conversation about the Galapagos directly in front of that figure. And so I'm also thinking about what are the possible associations between gardens and death that might be Byzantine. Part of me thinks that there isn't a direct Byzantine connection to the garden. And so I haven't really leaned into it too much, but I am curious to explore this a little bit more. Don't think an Annunciation connection, even despite angel, would work, but still, yeah.
Has access to the garden, especially if you look at Byzantine texts like with imperial gardens and all that. It's really, you know, the emperor, but like who else, and then who has access to this, especially in terms of clearing and access to the heavens of Paradisos or whatever, right, as the garden. Who can get in, who can get not, and what happens in that, right, when you have things happening. So
no, and one of the things that's very interesting about their movement through the house is that it's almost the structure of a sort of Roman house, because they go from entryway, throne room, into the garden as a sort of courtyard, and then they enter sort of the inner sanctum, which is his studio. And so it's a very fascinating thing. And then later on they come back into the garden for other parts of the scene of the play. But there is sort of this movement that's very much like these layers of confrontation, sort of peeling back reality. Yeah.
Questions? I think we'll wrap up. Thank you all for attending today's talk, and thanks to those who are tuning in online. Friendly reminder that the schedule for our talks, schedule of talks for our spring semester speaker series is available on our website. Our next event is a special Yeffer lecture presented with the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center by Dr. Leon Saltiel, titled Maternal Words, Community Anguish, Intimate Family Correspondence on the Eve of the Holocaust in Thessaloniki. This will take place on Tuesday, February 4th, at the Siegel Graduate School of Business on SFU's Vancouver campus. Hope to see you all there. And let's end by thanking our speakers.
Thank you, everyone. That was a great conversation. Appreciate it.